Her aunt smirked, brushing past propriety with a single line. "You work better with your hands than he ever did." And just like that, everything changed. The first time I set foot in her family's home, I felt the kind of nervous curiosity you only get when you're stepping into someone else's world, one you've only glimpsed in passing. The front door opened, and the warm scent of fresh coffee mingled with a faint, sweet trace of flowers. The sunlight poured in through lace curtains, dancing softly across polished wooden floors, and it made everything look calmer, somehow, than I expected. But then I saw her. Her aunt stood by the kitchen counter, effortless in her presence, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. She was in her early 40s, striking in a way that wasn't loud or demanding, but quietly magnetic. The kind of beauty that didn't need makeup to be noticed. The laugh lines near her eyes, the slight curve of her smile, the way she moved with ease and grace, almost as if she belonged to every space she entered. She was teasing with her expression, but her eyes, those steady, observing eyes, held something softer, a warmth that made me simultaneously anxious and intrigued. "Ah, you must be the famous boyfriend," she said lightly, her tone balancing curiosity and amusement. I caught the subtle smile tugging at her lips, and my stomach flipped in a way I hadn't expected. I smiled awkwardly, fumbling my words. She didn't laugh at me, which made it worse or better depending on how you looked at it. Her gaze held me, assessing, teasing, but not unkindly. The kitchen itself became a stage for every subtle motion. Sunlight highlighted the gentle curve of her hair as she tucked a strand behind her ear, and I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, delicate and inviting without being overpowering. She moved with a casual confidence that made my own clumsiness feel like a quiet joke only she understood. Even the way she reached for a coffee mug, her fingers brushing the ceramic, had a sort of grace that made me watch more than I should. I tried to focus on the conversation, light jokes about family and my first impressions, but I kept getting distracted by the way she leaned slightly forward to hear me, or the way her hand rested casually on the counter, close enough that if I reached, our fingers might brush. My mind caught in small loops. The warmth of her presence, the quiet authority in her tone, the subtle, unspoken tension that seemed to hum in the air around her. In that first encounter, there was no overt attraction, no dramatic spark, but there was curiosity. Mine and, I suspected, hers, and an unspoken question hanging between us. What would happen if the boundaries of familiarity stretched just a little? It was a quiet kind of tension, the kind that creeps into your chest and makes it harder to look away, and it promised that this visit would be more than just a polite family gathering. As the afternoon sunlight filtered across the kitchen, I realized I was watching her more than I should, noticing the soft cadence of her laugh, the way she moved as she poured coffee into delicate cups, the subtle strength in her hands. And in that moment, I understood that this first meeting wasn't just an introduction. It was the first step into something I couldn't yet name, but already felt deeply. It was supposed to be a simple task, a minor repair in her aunt's cozy living room, but somehow, the ordinary act of fixing a wobbly shelf became anything but ordinary. I knelt on the soft carpet, screwdriver in hand, trying to focus on aligning the brackets, while she hovered nearby. She didn't hover in a critical or overbearing way. She just stood close enough that I felt her presence brushing against me in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The warmth of her body radiated in the small space between us, a gentle, comforting pressure that made my heart speed up without any provocation. Her fingers brushed mine once as she handed me a small nail. It was a fleeting touch, almost accidental, or so it felt, but the moment lingered in my mind long after. She smirked, that teasing curve of her lips making it impossible to ignore the way her eyes held me. "You work better with your hands than he ever did," she said casually, and the words carried a weight I didn't expect. There was humor in them, yes, but also a kind of admiration. I felt a strange mixture of pride and embarrassment, aware that my own awareness of her, and the way she made me aware, was something entirely new. The room itself seemed to notice the change. Sunlight poured through the window, catching dust particles that floated lazily in the air, turning them into tiny golden motes that drifted around her. I found myself noticing everything. The gentle tilt of her head as she observed my movements, the small smile that lingered at the corner of her mouth, even the faint scent of flowers clinging to her blouse. Every little detail became amplified, as if the universe had quietly shifted its focus to the two of us. She leaned closer to guide my hand as I screwed in a stubborn bracket. Her warmth pressed lightly against my shoulder. I could feel the subtle tension in her fingers as she adjusted my grip, the gentle pressure guiding me but not controlling. It was intimate in a way that didn't need words. Every glance, every pause, every accidental brush of skin carried a weight that neither of us addressed directly but that hung in the air with undeniable presence. We joked softly as we worked, the humor punctuated by lingering eye contact and quiet smiles. There was no rush, no need to hurry. I realized I was studying the small nuances of her movements. How she tucked her hair behind her ear, how her lips curved when she laughed, the ease with which she moved around the room. And I sensed, with a mixture of fear and thrill, that she was noticing me in ways that went beyond casual observation. By the time the shelf was secured, my hands slightly sore and my mind buzzing, the room felt transformed. The mundane task had become a shared experience, a subtle dance of proximity and understanding. I left the living room with a quiet sense of connection, acutely aware of the lingering heat of her presence, the teasing tone of her voice, and the way her eyes seemed to hold unspoken questions. It was a first step, small, almost imperceptible, but it promised that the threads of something more had begun to weave themselves between us. It happened later that afternoon, after the laughter and teasing of small tasks had settled into a comfortable silence. She invited me to sit on the worn wooden bench in the garden, where the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the stone path. I followed, trying not to stumble over my own nerves. There was a gentleness in her invitation that made it feel like an opportunity, and a challenge to see her differently. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air smelled faintly of blooming jasmine, a subtle sweetness that seemed to match the quiet tension between us. She sat down beside me, just close enough that our shoulders brushed lightly, but not so close that it felt forced. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, an almost tangible presence that drew my attention like a magnet. I realized suddenly that the simple act of sitting next to her was charged with meaning I didn't yet know how to name. Then she spoke, her voice soft and unhurried, as though she were sharing a secret she hadn't told anyone in years. She told a story about a lost opportunity, a regret from her past that had left a subtle ache in her chest. Her words weren't dramatic, they didn't need to be. It was the quiet honesty, the vulnerability in the slight catch of her breath, the way her fingers flexed nervously on the bench, that made her story land with weight. I listened, captivated, feeling the pull of her humanity in a way that went beyond admiration or attraction. I noticed everything about her in that moment. The faint crease at the corner of her eyes, the way sunlight caught in her hair, the subtle tremor in her hand when she gestured. My own hands twitched with the urge to reach out, to brush her hair back or offer some gesture of comfort. But I held back, conscious of boundaries yet aware of a growing desire to connect. Our closeness was electric, silent yet speaking volumes, a conversation of glances and subtle shifts in posture. She glanced at me then, briefly, a half-smile playing at her lips. It was teasing, yes, but layered with something deeper. Trust, acknowledgement, an invitation for me to stay present. I shifted slightly, our arms brushing, and felt a warmth in my chest I couldn't quite name. I realized that it wasn't just physical proximity that stirred me. It was the shared space of honesty, the delicate tension of two people discovering each other in the quiet moments between words. For a while, we simply sat there. I caught the rhythm of her breathing, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the earthiness of the garden. Every gesture, every subtle movement seemed amplified in importance. When she finally laughed softly at a small joke I made, it felt like a secret the two of us alone could understand. By the time we returned to the house, something had shifted. There was a quiet intimacy now, an unspoken acknowledgement of connection. My heart was heavier, yet lighter, filled with curiosity and a tentative longing. She had shown me a glimpse of her vulnerability, and in turn, I realized I wanted to be worthy of it. That afternoon, I understood that our story wasn't about grand gestures. It was in these small, tender moments that the slow burn of something meaningful had begun. The next afternoon, the atmosphere shifted in a way that was both subtle and electric. We were in the sunlit living room again, this time tackling a trivial challenge she had presented. Arranging the bookshelf in a precise order. What should have been a mundane task became a stage for a quiet interplay of glances, gestures, and unspoken understanding. She leaned over to inspect my work, her hair falling in soft waves over her shoulder. Our hands brushed as she straightened a book, and the sensation lingered far longer than it should have. Her touch was light, casual, yet the warmth radiating from her hand sent a ripple of awareness through me. I tried to focus on the task, but the brush of her skin against mine felt like a small electric shock, a reminder that this interaction carried more weight than a simple chore. She smirked at me suddenly, a playful gleam in her eyes. "Are you sure you're doing it right? I might have to show you how it's really done." There was no judgment in her tone, only teasing and subtle challenge. I felt a mix of embarrassment and pride, the kind that comes from being both flustered and genuinely admired. I moved closer to demonstrate my method, and she tilted her head, studying me as if measuring both my skill and my reaction. The air between us hummed with tension, a quiet acknowledgement that our connection had grown more complicated and far more compelling. Every movement became a conversation of its own. The way she leaned slightly toward me, the soft exhale as she adjusted a book, the subtle brush of her hand against mine. Each action was charged with an intimacy neither of us dared to name aloud. I found myself acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the faint musk of old books and polished wood. My chest tightened in ways that had nothing to do with exertion. It was the quiet, magnetic pull of her presence that held me captive. We exchanged quiet jokes, playful banter layered with a weight of subtle implication. The challenge of arranging the shelves became secondary to the silent game we were playing, one of glances, light touches, and the careful negotiation of boundaries. Each smile she offered, each fleeting look, seemed designed to draw me in while leaving just enough space for restraint. At one point, our shoulders brushed again, more intentionally this time, or at least it felt intentional. I caught her glance, and she didn't look away. There was something unspoken there, a recognition of mutual curiosity and the growing tension that neither of us wanted to resolve too quickly. The moment hung between us like the golden afternoon light filtering through the windows, warm, suspended, and intimate. By the time the shelf was perfectly aligned, both of us lingered near it, reluctant to break the spell. I realized then that this playful tension wasn't just about teasing or tasks. It was about the slow, deliberate unfolding of attraction, a delicate dance of respect, curiosity, and subtle longing. Every glance, every brush of skin, every smirk had pushed us further into territory neither of us fully understood, yet both of us wanted to explore. As I left the room that evening, my hands still tingling from the contact, I felt an undeniable awareness. This connection was no longer accidental. The quiet intimacy, the teasing tension, and the electric closeness were shaping something far more compelling than either of us could ignore. The evening had settled into a gentle calm, the kind that only comes when the day's chaos drifts away, leaving the house quiet and intimate. She invited me to help with clearing the kitchen after dinner, though I suspected she didn't actually need the help. The air was filled with the soft scent of lingering food, mingling with her subtle perfume that seemed to linger wherever she moved. The lighting was warm, golden from the low lamps, casting long, soft shadows that danced across the countertops and floor. As we worked side by side, our movements carefully coordinated yet casual, I noticed how easily her presence wrapped around me. My hands brushed hers more than once while reaching for dishes or stacking glasses, and each accidental touch carried a strange, quiet electricity. She didn't flinch or step back. Instead, she allowed the contact, the weight of it hanging in the space between us, like a secret only we shared. At some point, we paused, both reaching for the same dish. Our fingers met, lingering just a moment too long for coincidence, and I felt the sudden heat in my chest. She met my gaze then, her smirk softening into something quieter, something that held curiosity and acknowledgement all at once. For a heartbeat, the room felt smaller, the world outside irrelevant. I realized she was watching me in a way that made me feel simultaneously exposed and understood. "You've changed since the first day I met you," she said quietly, her voice casual but carrying a weight I couldn't ignore. "I didn't expect you to be attentive, careful, thoughtful." There was no teasing in the words, just honest observation. I swallowed, feeling the awkwardness of my own emotions press against the quiet growing between us. I wanted to say something clever, something to ease the tension, but all I managed was a small, uncertain smile. She leaned slightly closer, enough that our shoulders touched. It wasn't forceful, not even conscious, but it mattered. I noticed the warmth of her proximity, the subtle scent of her hair as she tilted her head to brush it behind her ear, and the steady, unhurried rhythm of her breathing. Everything about the moment was heightened, the texture of the countertop beneath my palms, the faint clink of a dish being set down, the soft ambient hum of the house settling into night. I like being around you," I admitted finally, the words heavier than I expected. They were not dramatic, not a declaration, just honesty spilling out in a way I couldn't contain. She looked at me then, truly looked, and there was no teasing, no smirk, only that quiet acknowledgement of understanding and perhaps recognition of the same feeling mirrored in her eyes. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We simply let the silence stretch, filled with the unspoken admission of what had been growing quietly between us. I felt the heat of anticipation, the subtle pull of intimacy, and the delicate tension of mutual curiosity and restraint. Then she smiled softly, just enough to make my chest ache. A small, private victory that left the air charged yet comforting. By the time we finished the dishes, I realized something had shifted. Our connection was no longer a tentative curiosity. It had grown into something real, tangible, and quietly thrilling. There was an understanding now, unspoken but undeniable, that the slow, careful dance between us had taken a definitive step forward. And though nothing had changed physically beyond the soft brush of hands and shared glances, the weight of emotion made the world feel smaller, warmer, and infinitely more alive. The following afternoon felt different from the moment I stepped into her world. The sunlight slanted through the windows at just the right angle, casting warm golden lines across the living room floor. It highlighted the subtle movements of her hair, the curve of her smile, and the way her eyes seemed to catch every detail of me at once. There was a tension in the air, quiet but unmistakable, like the pause just before a note in a symphony hits its crescendo. We were sitting on the couch, sorting through a stack of old photo albums she had pulled from a shelf. It was a shared task, intimate in its quietness. Each photograph she handed me carried a story, a memory, a glimpse into a life I was just beginning to understand. As she leaned closer to point out a detail, her hand brushed mine, just enough to make me aware of her warmth, yet careful enough to respect boundaries. It was in these small, fleeting touches that the weight of our connection pressed most insistently. Her eyes met mine, holding a gaze that was longer and more searching than before. I felt a sudden, unspoken question pass between us. How far could we let this closeness go without breaking the delicate balance we had built? I swallowed hard, aware of the rapid thrum of my heartbeat and the subtle ache of anticipation coiling in my chest. Then she smirked lightly, teasing in her usual way, yet there was an undercurrent of seriousness beneath it. "I knew you were better with your hands," she said softly, echoing the earlier joke but layering it with an intimate familiarity that made my pulse spike. The words weren't just playful, they were acknowledgement. A recognition that what had been developing between us was no longer simple curiosity, no longer just friendly teasing. It was real. It was mutual. I shifted slightly closer, letting the couch cushions press against us, and I felt the warmth of her shoulder brush against mine. There was a charged silence, filled only by the quiet rustle of the pages we turned and the faint hum of the house settling around us. I wanted to reach for her hand, to linger a moment longer than propriety allowed, yet something in her gaze assured me she understood my hesitation, and perhaps shared it. For a while, we simply existed in that space, caught in a quiet understanding that needed no words. The emotional tension had reached its peak. Curiosity, desire, and restraint intertwined so tightly that even a simple glance felt electric. I realized that the slow burn of our relationship wasn't about dramatic gestures or overt declarations. It was the quiet closeness, the lingering touches, the shared understanding that bound us. Finally, she smiled softly, that mixture of teasing and tenderness I had come to recognize as uniquely hers. "I'm glad you're here," she said, almost whispering, and in that moment, the entire room seemed to shrink around us, leaving only the two of us suspended in the delicate gravity of our connection. The world outside ceased to matter. The uncertainty, the hesitation, the thrill of proximity, they all crystallized into a single truth. We were undeniably drawn to one another, yet fully aware of the care and respect required to navigate the feelings we were only beginning to name. That afternoon, I understood something vital. Our story had reached a turning point. Not a conclusion, but a peak of recognition and emotional clarity. Whatever came next, the bond we had built through quiet observation, playful tension, and subtle intimacy was real, undeniable, and charged with possibility. By the time evening settled over the house, the golden sunlight had softened into a gentle twilight. The kitchen smelled faintly of the dinner we had shared earlier, a comforting mix of herbs and warm dishes. The quiet hum of the house, the faint creak of floorboards, the occasional rustle of leaves outside, created a cocoon-like intimacy, one that seemed to hold the space between us in a delicate suspension. She was sitting on the couch, the photo albums we had looked through still resting beside her, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. I sat down beside her, close enough that our shoulders brushed lightly. The warmth radiating from her was comforting yet charged with the familiar tension that had been building for weeks. It was a tension I had come to crave, subtle yet undeniable, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection we had been nurturing. We spoke softly, our conversation meandering from casual memories to small reflections on life. But beneath the surface of every word was the weight of unspoken emotion. I found myself noticing every detail about her. The way her hand rested on the couch arm, the tilt of her head when she laughed quietly, the subtle glint in her eyes when she looked at me. Each gesture, each expression, felt layered with meaning. An invitation to linger in the shared moment without needing to force it into words. At one point, she reached over to brush a stray strand of hair from my forehead. The contact was brief, gentle, yet it carried a significance that went beyond mere gesture. I felt the warmth of her fingers, the softness of her touch, and the quiet understanding that we were both aware of the weight it carried. It was a simple act, but in it lay all the tension, curiosity, and unspoken admiration that had built between us over time. She smirked softly, teasing me with a phrase that had become almost a private refrain. "You really do work better with your hands." I laughed, the sound mingling with hers in a quiet harmony, and I realized that the teasing had transformed into something deeper, a shared acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between us. For a long while, we simply sat there, shoulder to shoulder, hands occasionally brushing, smiles exchanged in silence. There was no need for grand declarations, no need to force resolution. The emotional intimacy we had cultivated, the trust, the teasing, the quiet moments of vulnerability was enough. In that shared presence, I felt a clarity I hadn't expected. Our connection was real, profound, and lasting, regardless of what words we used to define it. As the twilight deepened, we finally rose together, moving through the house with a lightness and ease that spoke of comfort and understanding. I caught her gaze one last time before leaving the room, and she held it, a mixture of warmth, acknowledgement, and gentle promise shimmering in her eyes. That night, I walked away with a quiet satisfaction that lingered long after the door closed behind me. The slow burn of our relationship had reached its resolution, not in a dramatic flourish, but in subtle, meaningful moments. The brushes of hands, the soft smiles, the shared laughter, and the emotional honesty that had carried us this far. We had arrived at a place of mutual respect and recognition, a connection that would continue to influence both our lives in ways neither of us could ignore. Even in the softest, simplest moments, I knew that what had grown between us was something rare, a bond that was tender, alive, and unforgettable. If you felt the slow burn of their connection, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more heartwarming age gap romances. Comment below, whose story do you want us to explore next?